Okay, members, could I formally declare the meeting open and open to the public as well, and formally welcome everyone here this morning, and just remind members and indeed everyone else in the room just to remind switching off their electronic devices and so on, and reminding members just the protocols around the use of the electronic tablets. Any apologies to record? None to record, so moving on. Moving then on to the pension schemes bill, then item number 2 on the agenda, the ministerial briefing, and as I understand it under 42A, the minister would be here this morning to ask the committee to deal with the pension schemes bill by way of accelerated passage. But before we welcome Minister yourself here this morning and your colleagues,
Thank you.
we're meeting keenly to have you here at the committee, and obviously this morning you're here just to address specifically the pension schemes bill and the issue of accelerated passage, but perhaps you would maybe just reflect on maybe the importance of coming to the committee at some point as soon as possible, really sooner rather than later, really, in terms of just the broader issues that the committee want to be engaging in the time ahead. So, but over to yourself, Minister, and your colleagues, just for the purpose of the business schedule.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and I am glad to be here today, and I look forward to coming back again and to engaging in relation to the issues which are broader in terms of the work of the department, and obviously now that the committee has moved on to other things, it's right now that we will ensure that we have that working relationship, which I think is vitally important for us all. Chair, you will recall that my officials briefed the committee on the content of the bill and the outcome of the Equality Impact Assessment on the 30th of April. I'm going to just then briefly summarise what the bill does and explain the reasoning behind the request for the committee's support for accelerated passage for the bill. Provisions of pensions involves financial, economic and longevity risks, all of which come with significant costs. Existing pension legislation is largely based on a binary system of money purchase schemes, commonly referred to as defined contribution schemes, which offer no certainty over retirement benefits, and non-money purchase schemes, commonly referred to as defined benefit schemes, which traditionally offer salary-related pension benefits, providing certainty about what will be paid in retirement. The key difference between these models is who bears the risk. In the defined benefit schemes, the risks inherent in pension savings, examples are for those associated with longevity, investment and inflation, are borne by the sponsoring employer. In defined contribution schemes, they are borne by the individual. As membership in defined benefit schemes in the private sector has declined, there has been growth in the membership of other types of private pensions, and in particular in defined contribution pensions. This means that the risk associated with ensuring that pensions deliver a practical level of income in retirement is increasingly being borne by individuals rather than by employers. Pension schemes designs which allows for those risks to be shared, resulting in less risk being placed on any one party, are arguably limited by current pension legislation. The bill will create a new legislative framework for private pensions, which will establish 3 mutually exclusive categories of scheme type based on the different types of promise offered to members during the accumulation phase. The categories are defined benefit schemes, a scheme in which the member has a full pensions promise about the rate of the retirement income they will receive for life from a fixed normal pension age. Shared risk scheme, also known as defined ambition, a scheme where there is a promise about some of the retirement benefits, whether income or lump sum. And thirdly, defined contribution schemes, a scheme where there is no promise about the benefit outcome. Expanding the legislative framework to allow for shared risk schemes will allow the pensions industry to design new pension scheme products, including collective benefit schemes, which are defined in Part 2 of the bill. Collective benefits are provided on the basis of allowing the scheme's assets to be used in a way that pools risks across the membership. We do not offer a specific pension promise on the level of benefit payable, but there will be a target benefit. Target must be achievable within a specified probability range in order to provide scheme members with some confidence about the indication of what they might expect from the scheme. It is expected that enabling new scheme designs will provide better outcomes for members than the current defined contribution schemes and allow for greater risk sharing between members and scheme providers. The bill also amends existing legislation, mostly as a consequence of the change to scheme definitions and the provisions about collective benefit. It aims to ensure that current legislative requirements relating to scheme governance and administration apply in the appropriate way to the new categories, and enables requirements on governance and administration to apply to the specific needs of members of shared risk schemes. For example, the bill would make changes to subsisting rights legislation to ensure that existing member protection against detrimental amendments to rights in a scheme apply correctly under the new categories. So in relation, therefore, Chair, to the issue of accelerated passage and its necessity in this set of circumstances, under standing orders, the Minister in charge of a bill is required to explain to the appropriate committee the reasons for seeking accelerated passage. As outlined in the briefing paper provided to members, although pensions are a devolved matter, in effect there is a single pension system and a regulatory regime across the United Kingdom. Many private pension schemes operating in Northern Ireland are UK schemes. Additionally, the Pensions Regulator, the Pensions Ombudsman and the Pension Protection Fund operate a UK-wide basis. Therefore, it is highly desirable that the same regulatory framework is in place in Northern Ireland to facilitate the compliance and enforcement. The Westminster Government intends that the new pension scheme definitions and provisions to allow schemes to offer collective benefits outlined in the Pension Scheme Act of 2015 will come fully into effect from April 2016. The intention is that the equivalent Northern Ireland provisions will come into operation at the same time. If accelerated passage is not granted, the best case scenario is that the bill could complete its legislative passage through the Assembly and receive royal assent towards the end of February of 2016. The fact that the new law in Northern Ireland will not be settled until shortly before the proposed operational date will create significant uncertainty for both the pensions industry and employers. The industry needs a significant lead-in time to develop new pension products, and this requires certainty that any new products will be compatible with Northern Ireland law. For example, collective benefit schemes can only operate most effectively where they are able to create economies of scale. And to help achieve this, it is important that collective benefit schemes are able to operate on a UK-wide basis. So employers will also look for an early indication of how the changes could affect them. The ongoing rollout of automatic enrolment means that every employer must automatically enrol workers into a workplace pension scheme. Employers who are seeking to establish an occupational pension scheme, perhaps for the first time, may decide that they cannot select certain schemes as there is a chance that they may not be compatible with Northern Ireland law. And this could undermine the objectives of the bill and potentially result in Northern Ireland workers being enrolled into a defined contribution scheme which offer no certainty over pension outcomes. Additionally, the new regime will require numerous regulations to be in place well before April of 2016 to ensure adequate safeguards and protections are in place. Without accelerated passage, the short time frame from royal assent to operation will make this very challenging and add to the uncertainty facing schemes and employers. So in conclusion, Chair, I'm sure that we all want to ensure that individuals are afforded the best opportunities to save for their retirement through robust private prevention schemes, and maybe some of us should declare an interest as we hurtle towards that particular date. The Commissioner for Older People is supportive of the bill's objectives and has acknowledged that recognition of shared risk schemes in legislation has the potential to expand the reach of private pensions. And I know that the committee rightly take their scrutiny role seriously. I too value that role, and the scrutiny of the recent pensions bill highlighted the importance of that role. Therefore, granting accelerated passage for the bill would not be seen as setting a precedent for future bills in this field. I understand the committee has already received several briefings on the bill's proposals. Indeed, the committee has actively engaged with officials to consider both a legislative consent motion in relation to extending part of the Pension Schemes Act 2015 to Northern Ireland and the potential equality impacts associated with the Northern Ireland Bill. I fully appreciate, Chair, that by shortening the process, the committee will not have the same opportunity to scrutinise the bill in detail. However, I hope in this case that members are content with the broad thrust of the bill and can see the need for accelerated passage to ensure its early enactment. I would therefore invite that the committee would support the accelerated passage for the pension bills, the pension schemes bill. And can I say, in conclusion, Chair, as well, that my officials have and will continue to be available to give to members and to the committee whatever queries and questions they have in relation to this particular issue, because I do recognise that it is detailed, it is complicated, and there can be times other issues that arise. And I think, as you have seen in the past, when it comes to this particular issue, my officials have made themselves more than available to be able to answer the queries that arise from the committee. Thank you very much.
Okay, Minister, thank you for that. And on that note, I would again place on record thanks to your officials for their very good support to the committee and our deliberations of these matters. And just to remind ourselves then, before we bring members in, that the committee obviously has considered the key aspects of the bill, and we in fact agreed to report on legislative consent motion, and that was as far back as January of this year. But we have very much appreciated and valued the work of the officials supporting our work on this. So I think it's important to put that on the record. Jim, you were looking into.
Yeah, Minister, just to explain, your bill, is it identical in content to the Westminster bill?
It's a reflection. I don't think, is there maybe some slight variation, but by and large it is.
Yes,
Where's
like
the
say by
variation?
and large, I would say that it is. It's
where's
word
the
for word.
deviation?
Well, there's some areas such, we have to make reference to our law, as opposed to the GB law. But it's in terms of what the bill is actually doing at each provision. Yes, it's the same.
The common terms of its intent will be exactly the same.
So, we had a legislative consent motion to part of the Westminster bill. If, for all intents and purposes, our bill was identical, and we didn't even have a separate consultation on it, we simply had the Westminster consultation, why have we just not got a legislative consent procedure for the whole bill?
It's in terms of the bill from Westminster, and so why we asked for that is there were a number of things that had to be enforced for the 6, 4 and 15. And we would not have been able to have brought any bill through the Assembly in that time period. Those changes had been linked into the changes and to the law on actually tax and as how you can access your such pension pot. And all those were being brought in from 6/4/15, and so we couldn't have actually matched that date. And that's why we asked for that. We at all times are very conscious that this area of pensions actually falls under the control of the Assembly, and therefore that we would only ask for the LCM as such, where that we have issues of something has to be enforced for a certain date which we can't meet.
But we could have simply had legislative consent to the whole bill, the whole Westminster bill, could we?
Yes, that would have been possible if indeed, that had been the view of the committee. But it's in general our rule is because this matter falls under the control of the Assembly.
What you're recommending to us is that we pass an identical bill in our own name, which will have the same legislative effect as the Westminster bill.
Yeah.
Yes, we are. And I would have to say that we do that simply because under the Northern Ireland Act, but this is a such matter for the Assembly.
Of course, it's only in matters which are devolved that you can have a legislative consent motion.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, like,
But
the fact
I'm
that
just
it's
saying
devolved
that
isn't
we
a
work
barrier
on
to
that basis.
legislative
No.
consent.
No, it's not. That's why that we use them, when we have matters of timing. But I say as a rule, it's because this matter falls under the control of the Assembly that we tend to bring the legislation, it's in front of the Assembly.
And de facto, it's not really an option to make any changes to this legislation to put ourselves out of kilter with the rest of the UK, is it?
Well, indeed, you know, and once again, if there were any changes put forward by the committee, I think we would have to look at them, you know, and see as to what they did. Would they help the bill? Would you know, and we'd have to see whether or not that, you know, actually would we think that they
The
work.
regulation
You know,
process.
so I actually couldn't say that we could never accept any amendment put forward, you know.
The regulation process, the regulator process is not premised on there being a uniform system across the UK.
Yes, it is. However, you know, as such, but if the Assembly actually were to take a view that they wanted something different to be done, then I think we would have to speak to the pensions regulator and see as to how that could be done.
Might that require, depending on the extent, our own regulator?
Well, again, it would all depend what, but if in fact the change was something which is all very minor, no, it mightn't. However, if we ended up with a situation where our whole system ended up being out of kilter with GB, well then yes, it might mean we have to have our own regulator. But again, I can't really say until I would see what the amendment was doing and, you know, as to how it might look and what effect it would have.
And I think the other issue too is, given the fact that you have not only the issue of the pension regulator, but the issue of the pensions ombudsman, and you also have the issue of the pension protection funds, which all operate on a UK-wide basis, then I think it gives that degree of protection right across the piece, that we are buying into something which is more based on UK, simply because of the operational outcomes that come and flow from the way in which it's constructed.
But all of which would point to me the common sense position being simply to put legislative consent to the whole bill.
You know the saying, sometimes common sense is not very common, so I think that's a matter of interpretation.
Gregory, answer. Right.
Yeah, it was really a wider question I wanted to ask, just about, I mean, we've read in some of the financial press over the course of the past month or so about concerns that people have about the flexibilities that are currently being enacted, particularly in personal pension schemes, about the potential scams that are emerging and people being somewhat more gullible than they could have been in the past because of the restrictions that there were previously, which are gradually loosening. I mean, and I know I've and others have raised it at Westminster, but my question really is, are there going to be any specific Northern Ireland-wide issues raised within the department to alert people to the possibilities of scams emerging? Or is it just going to be a sort of a wide pension industry issue that is raised by the companies to alert people that they should be aware that people may ring them up on cold calling, they may write to them, they may offer them specific very high returns which are just unreal? Or is DSD going to do something in terms of warning people?
It's in terms of that issue, this area actually falls to the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, because and therefore as such, but they would be the lead group and they would operate for the whole of the UK. And so it actually falls to them to take the lead on this, to advise people to be careful, because I think it's in terms of what you're speaking of. It's where somebody phones you up to say, "I can offer you, X return." Such that isn't a issue for pensions. That's somebody who says that they are able to sell you a financial service.
Right. But it would be purely an issue to be dealt with by the regulatory body?
Yeah, yes, it would. It's the Financial Conduct Authority.
And presumably only if that was seen not to be effective, that there would then have to be something done, presumably by DWP in London?
Well, yes, but it's in terms of this, I would have to say, the whole of the pension scheme, I think it does cross over, between the Financial Conduct Authority, also the pensions regulator, and indeed, and for DWP and ourselves. We all interlink on this, but it's in terms of that, actually point which you are raising, as such, but that has been laid on by the FCA.
Okay, great. Thank you. Stuart, and right.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for presentation with regards to accelerated passage. This isn't really, I suppose, directly related to that aspect of this bill, or indeed whether this bill covers this aspect, but it was just on the basis that I think Mr Alistair was referencing the fact that this is Northern Ireland legislation and that there are things that we could do to it if it was appropriate. This is really, in a sense, going a little back in history. You might remember that there was certainly a great deal of community interest, and possibly would be described as a scandal at the time when a pension scheme in Northern Ireland was actually being delivered from the Republic of Ireland. I believe it was Richardson's Fertilisers. Is there now legislation in place, or is there anything that we need to do to ensure that those scandals do not occur, and is this a vehicle to do that through, particularly given the changing nature of this?
I think that given the work that has flowed from the Pensions Act, there has been a huge attempt made to try and ensure that we close down as many of the opportunities for people to do something which they otherwise would want to do, and that is people who would have a rogue element. So I think that if you see all that has flown from the Pensions Act right through until this particularly covers, of course, private pension. I think that that's where, and it in a sense flows on from what Gregory was asking. When you have the operations of the pensions regulator, the pensions ombudsman, and the pension protection fund, and also the work that Jerry referred to in relation to the Financial Control Authority, I think those all should give us the assurance that that would now be less likely. Okay?
Any scheme which is based outside of NI or else Britain, that is a cross-border scheme, and I mean it's cross-border in the terms of the whole of Europe.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay, not just inside Ireland context. And there actually now are such separate rules which apply to cross-border schemes in general.
Okay. I think, Chair, perhaps it's an area we might want to just investigate, not necessarily in respect of this, but it's an area which I think we do require certainty and assurance of.
And if it's helpful, sure, what we will do is we can provide additional information in relation to that. It might help to give some more clarity or assurance to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Roy.
Again, thanks for the presentation. I had no idea that there was so much law and regulation around pensions. Certainly it is a very complex area, that's something that is apparent. And with that potentially comes bureaucracy and cost and a burden on those who might want to save for the future, because ultimately that bureaucracy has to be paid for. So in terms of the insurance industry, in Northern Ireland there was concern at one stage that there was a lack of competition, and certainly I think it is important that we do not make any adjustment which might limit the number of pensions that are on offer here. I mean, if we were to make significant changes, I take it I'd be right in saying that many pensions that might be on offer elsewhere would not be afforded here because it would be different rules. Would that be factually correct?
Yeah.
Well, actually, that would be the big risk here. You know that if we were to get out of kilter with GB, then at the moment, I would have to say that the vast majority of such pension products which are here are all based inside Britain. I think we just had actually one local institution which offered products, and I'm not even sure if they still do so. So they were all coming from GB.
Going back to the legislative consent motion, I'm just trying to tease out a little bit more about why we've decided, having given that legislative consent motion, that it didn't actually go through with the legislation at Westminster, that it's back here again. Why did it not all go through?
Go ahead.
But the LCM only was for certain parts of the bill. Each LCM has to actually specify as to which bits are as such being covered. And so the LCM hadn't been for the whole bill.
Okay. Another aspect is that I just heard on the radio, certainly within this last week, there's been discussion about how the new pension system has been rolled out to larger employers and then to smaller employers as it goes along. It's starting to get to the stage that everyone has to be enrolled and offer pension to all. employees. With there being a higher proportion of smaller employers in Northern Ireland, are there anything that we are looking to that needs to be done different by way of, even in terms of support and guidance?
Well, it's in terms of this, but this falls actually to the pensions regulator. Okay, that's part of their function for which we pay them to do. And actually what they do is they will actually get in touch with each firm or each employer, it's no matter how small they are, and they will offer them help and guidance, and they will write out to them in advance and say that your dates will be inside X months' time, therefore that you need to be starting to think about what you have to do. And there is help and guidance available.
The department,
and for small employers and for each employer, no matter what their size. However, this comes as such from the pensions regulator.
is the department satisfied that that is sufficient to deal with our particular situation?
Well, I would have to say so far that we haven't had any issue as such, which is only for Northern Ireland. No, I haven't seen any Northern Ireland issue. And we have been working with the pensions regulator from the very start of this whole process to ensure that they were over inside Northern Ireland, that they have come here and that they have actually met with groups of employers, etc., and that they are contacting employers here.
And
So we don't have any reason to suppose it's not working.
And the pensions regulator has also informed us that around 99% of the employers who have completed the registration have done that without the need for the pension regulator to use any of its statutory powers. So I think that that's encouraging, because then you're dealing with get to 99%. I think you're heading in the right direction in relation to giving some comfort around the employers being reasonably content with the process as it currently is constructed.
Okay, thank you.
Right, Roy, thank you. No other members indicating, so Minister, could I thank yourself and your team for coming to committee this morning and making the case, and we'll obviously now just continue to discuss our approach to that, so thank you again, and we look forward to scheduling a meeting with yourself.
Yes.
Shortly.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Anne and Jerry and Maureen. Okay, members, you've heard the case before by the Minister and his team, so the members content that we accede to the request for dealing with the bill by way of accelerated passage?
Agreed.
Everybody agreed on that? Thank you very much, and then we'll formally write and advise the Minister of that. Okay, members, thank you very much for that. Okay, I can move then on to the back to the agenda. As is normal, in terms of the draft minutes, I suppose that the draft minutes from the 28th of May 2015, and they're on page 6 of your pack. Members content the minutes of the 28th of May as drafted for accuracy. Thank you very much. A couple of points on our chairperson business, just to advise members that the chair of the committee have been invited to an inauguration ceremony of the Consulate General of the People's Republic of China, and that's to be held on Monday the 8th of June. We also have a request for members to attend a barbecue event to join Sir John Elvich, former Permanent Secretary to the Scottish Government, and that's to be held on the 10th of June at Ormond Road Prison. Anybody wants to attend that event, let them know, or have an extended stay perhaps, even if there was. Okay, so we also have an invitation which has been issued to chairs and deputy chairs of statutory committees. This is by the Carnegie UK Trust and School of Law at Queen's. I'm unable to attend that event, and obviously the deputy chair has formally stood down from the assembly, so I could ask if any members who have saw this invitation and who may be available, could they contact the clerk, maybe with the view to somebody from the committee attending this particular event? Okay. Again, just a further invitation to the Law Centre has invited Mr Michael McMahon, member of the Scottish Parliament and the chair of Scotland's Welfare Reform Committee. The invite is for him to talk to members of the Law Centre's Welfare Reform Group about the work of the Scottish Committee and that's to be held on Friday the 3rd of July. I've been invited to attend and speak at that as part of a Q&A session. Specifically, a Law Centre wants to hear the committee's thoughts on engaging with NGOs in the process of evidence giving, and obviously we have extensive experience on that. So I think Kevin at least will be attending that event as well. Okay, so again, just moving on to matters arising, just from correspondence. You'll have at page 132 of your meeting pack, you have correspondence from the department in relation to licensing of pavement cafes. You'll remember, members, that IMTAC and the Guide Dogs for Blind Association recently wrote to the committee raising concerns in relation to draft guidelines from the department, and we forwarded that on to the department. The department has advised us that IMTAC has now written the minister seeking a meeting to discuss their continuing concerns, and it is expected this meeting will take place very shortly, though a date has not yet been set. The officials are in the process of updating the working draft of the guidelines and will produce a formal draft document once the Minister has had an opportunity to meet with IMTAC. Sir, on that basis, could I suggest then a joint briefing by IMTAC and the Guide Dogs for the Blind Association be scheduled for the committee meeting perhaps on the 11th of June, if that's agreeable for members?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you for that. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, which we have a briefing on the Supporting People review from CRISP. So could I formally welcome representatives from CRISP, Ricky Rowledge, Cameron Martin, Deirdre Canavan and Chris Alexander. Just to remind members again then that the Department for Social Development is due to brief the committee on its review of the Supporting People programme, and that briefing is due on the 25th of June next. And so I would refer you then to the briefing paper provided at page 13 of your meeting pack, and the note a copy of the terms of reference to the Department's review, and that's provided on page 19 of your pack. So without any further ado then, could I invite then Ricky, Cameron and your colleagues Deirdre and Chris to make your presentation to the committee, and thanks very much for attending here to give us some support to allow us to obviously deal perhaps as robustly as we need to when the department are here on the 25th. So,
well, thank you very much indeed, Chairman and Committee, for being willing to hear us talk to you yet again about the Supporting People programme. I'd like to introduce my colleagues to you. Deirdre Canavan is from DePaul, Ireland. Cameron Watt from the Federation of Housing Associations, who's going to be talking about older people's services today, and Chris Alexander from Triangle Housing Association. My three colleagues represent the three thematic groups by which commissioning takes place under the Supporting People programme, and it's also very relevant because the review and the emerging findings from the review will have a slightly differential impact on each of those areas, and they're going to take a few minutes to talk about that. Now, I recognise all the faces, fortunately, around this table, and I know that you all know a lot about the Supporting People.
I don't think we have met, have we?
About the Supporting People programme, which is a very quick recap. Supporting People programme started from legislation 2003. It provides housing-related support services to around about 26,000 people every year. Of those, probably about 17,000 at any one time. Some of them are quite short-term services, and so people move in and out of those services. Now, there has been over £700 million of public money spent on supporting people's services since the inception of the programme 12 years ago. And it's for the reason that there are so many vulnerable groups that are supported by this programme, and the vast extent of public investment, that as a sector we welcome this review. It's been a long time coming, but we do have concerns to ensure that the review does not undermine the sustainability of that programme, and that we continue to have housing-related support funded in a ring-fenced and a way that actually manages to appropriately provide services of the correct quality and to the right people. Our preliminary concerns in regard to the review, there are a few issues. I'm going to touch very briefly on them and then pass on to my colleagues. The first would be around the age-old debate of what is housing-related support and what is care. Now, this has been ongoing for 20-odd years, and these are complementary, and there is no doubt a grey area. But we would state, and I think that it has been highlighted within the review, that there has been an overdependence within commissioning towards the priorities of health and social work and social care. And we feel very strongly that money perhaps has been paid that could perhaps have been picked up and should have been picked up by the health budget, but we would not want that to be detrimental to the sustainability of the housing-related support budget, and that there should not be any transfer of any money from one budget to the other. That there are very, very clear guidelines about what are the eligible tasks for supporting people, and the money that goes into that programme should be spent on that. The second we would have around the commissioning structures, and that they are not In fact, the review has highlighted that they most decidedly are not transparent. In fact, we don't even know who does the commissioning, and we would be asking that the Minister and the committee would ensure that there was a much greater involvement of the provider sector in an advisory role. We're not asking for us to be commissioners. There certainly would be a conflict of interest there, but that we have a lot of understanding and knowledge of what's happening on the ground that should be leading commissioning priorities, and that once again those commissioning priorities are in relation to housing-related support. And I think, finally, I would just like to touch upon the whole issue within the emerging findings in the review around about competitive tendering and about value for money. And we would strongly state that if we are to maintain quality, that has to be given equal weight in regard to the amount of money that is spent in the programme. Competitive tendering, where it has been introduced in other parts, in Great Britain, has on a whole been detrimental, not only to the service providers, who are the most important, but also in regard to the amount of money that is spent on staff and professionalising staff. And in fact, yesterday at NIFA's excellent conference, we had a colleague from Scotland who said how they struggled even to be paying a living wage to qualified staff because of cuts in the programme and because of competitive tendering. And I think we have a choice in Northern Ireland, and we would ask you to take that into consideration. I'll ask my colleague now, Deirdre, to talk to you around about homelessness.
Again, I'd like to thank you for our opportunity to come and present to you today. In DePaul, we are a homeless charity providing accommodation and floating support services to an array of individuals with complex needs who are faced with the situation of homelessness or the threat of becoming homeless. And we provide our services into 4 key areas, providing support to vulnerable families, people who are homeless with addictions, the prevention of homelessness, and also homelessness within the criminal justice system. Across the province, we have 10 services, and we work with the most vulnerable households in the country, and indeed the most vulnerable persons within the homeless or who are experiencing homelessness. This has fundamentally been funded by Supporting People, and we pioneer and provide unique and innovative services. A particular example of this would include, as some of you may already know, of our Stella Maris service, which provides accommodation and support for people who have chronic alcohol issues. Cloverhill and Mater Day provide temporary accommodation for families, and that's for single parents, for couples and their children who have no permanent accommodation. In Derry and Belfast, we have supported accommodation, or we have a day service there for people who have chronic alcohol issues, and we also have floating support services and a Housing First model in the city as well. Last year, we supported across our accommodation and community-based services over 700 adults and over 214 families. We play a key part in the delivery of the Housing Executive's homeless strategy, and our services are funded primarily by Supporting People. Last year, our services were funded up to 62% in 2014 and 68% in 2015. The vast majority of the costs that come in to us is gone out in salary costs to our frontline staff. Since 2009, which is 7 years, there has been no uplift in the salaries, and all salaries have been frozen with no increments or inflationary uplifts. Despite this, we have managed to maintain morale and motivation due to our efforts within the staff teams. This is very important because obviously the staff are on a daily basis engaging with and supporting people who have very complex needs and very often very challenging behaviours. So ensuring that the staff are well trained and highly motivated to continue to provide that level of service, I guess you could say, for more challenging groups, because obviously there's more complexity of need now, and they need to be kept up to speed with what they need to know to be able to support those individuals. And not having any uplift in salary, we've had to be very prudent of how we've used our income. Due to the fact that costs, I mean, we run the organisation right down to the bone. There is no fat, shall we say, to be trimmed. So there's no scope for us to give any salary increase. And when you think about the inflationary lifts that have happened across society, really in general, we haven't been able to give people any uplift in that to meet those costs. Staff effectively have taken a 20% pay cut in real terms, and we know that any cuts within our budget would mean that there would be staffing cuts, or we would have to dilute the service provision that we have, or we would have to lose services altogether. That, we feel, would spiral the individuals that we work with to go to other services, probably within the health sector, and they would be more costly services. We consider that the services are considerable value for money, and an example of this would be that last year we moved 39 people into the community who were those that suffered with real entrenched alcohol difficulties, and we managed to do that through our Housing First programme with 1.5 staff. That means that the issues lie in coordinating, the service is supported by coordinating our health-related and social care services. So the individuals coordinate those wraparound services for those individuals to ensure that they can sustain tenancies within their community. The Supporting People Fund is the glue, really, that holds this whole approach together. And the loss of funding would mean that the cohesiveness that Supporting People provides would mean that other services are not coordinated adequately, and it bridges the gap for us between a diverse set of funders and programmes. So the main impacts for us are that we prevent people from entering into homelessness. We worked with over 600 households last year. We are diverting people from imprisonment, getting people out of temporary accommodation, and preventing use of expensive health-related services. We did a study in 2013 in our day service in Derry, and the impact of that saw significant savings in the presentations to accident and emergency, and also to the PSNI arrests for people who were street drinking or with complex issues in the streets of the city. So therefore we felt that those services, key frontline services, were the money that needed to go into them could be into them, and they could obviously meet the other needs across the city. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Supporting People provides a wide range of vital services for older people, and over 10,000 older people are currently benefiting both through accommodation-based and floating support services in the community. And I suppose they're all helping older people to live as independently and with as much dignity as possible in their own homes, preventing or delaying other problems in the progression to more intensive requirements through, for example, residential or nursing care. You're very well aware of the demographic challenges of our fast ageing population, the implications for older services, not just of many more older people, but many more very old people. It's a good thing, but it does create huge issues. And I suppose we would say that supporting people across the board is not only massively improving the quality of life for tens of thousands of vulnerable people, but it is also generating major net financial savings to the Northern Ireland public purse. And there was a recent study that, using a methodology from GB, that demonstrated that for every £1 invested in supporting people services in Northern Ireland, £1.90 is accrued in savings for the public purse through things like reduction in requirement for the criminal justice system, or reduction in the requirement for health and social care. And those savings are particularly great for older people. The estimation is that for every £1 invested through SP and services for older people, we're generating net financial benefits of £2.60. So it's a huge benefit. an increasing number of the services are for people, floating support services in the community, so that can be people in any type or tenure of home. It's really about helping them to sustain their accommodation, sustain their tenancy, lots of practical, just that wee bit of help, whether it's paying your bills, managing your money, looking after the house, ensuring it's properly maintained, remaining included in the community so that you're not isolated. A huge range of practical help that is very valuable. And then again at the lower end, there's a lot of sheltered housing that is sustained through supporting people. Sheltered housing has proved a very successful model here, and a lot of the help, for example, scheme coordinators, providing that little bit of help and reassurance, that is all funded through SP. And then at the more sort of high-end need of the spectrum, we have more intensive interventions like supported living schemes, where there's a big element of care as well as housing support, and the likes of Cedar Court in Downpatrick or the new Hemsworth Court development off the Shankill in Belfast. And this is a successful model of housing and health working together, playing to our strengths to help, again, older people retain that independence and dignity even when they do have mild to moderate dementia, and preventing an acceleration of the dementia and preventing unnecessary admissions to residential and nursing care. So overall, this partnership with housing and health is working well, but I think there are some key issues, and as I set out in my paper, I think a lot of those were helpfully identified in the Health Committee's inquiry last year into the potential role of supported living in the implementation of TYC, Transforming Your Care. And I think that I think DSD has made a good effort to try and engage our partners in the health and social care side to ensure that there is a proper partnership of equals, that there is a robust strategic needs assessment for the sort of intensive interventions for supported living, that there is a fair sharing of risk in schemes, because often you get the housing side developing a brand new state-of-the-art dementia service like Hemsworth Court, and then the trust can take 12 or 18 months to actually populate that, and that's generating huge losses for the housing association through no fault of their own, that diminishes our ability to provide future such schemes. So I think we would say that housing has a huge role to play in delivering TYC, and that the health and social care system are not really engaging with DSD and the housing family in the way that they need to realise that. And we hope that as we get to the next programme for government and the next spending period, there are real opportunities to address that.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee again for the opportunity just to present our views on the Supporting People programme. Triangle Housing Association provides accommodation-based services, sometimes in partnership with other agencies, to over 500 people who would be in receipt of Supporting People funding. And in addition also provides floating support services to another 500 individuals, sometimes in other landlord accommodation, including some public sector accommodation. In addition, Triangle also provides employment support and preparation to about 350 people who would have a learning disability or are in the autistic spectrum. And also Triangle, over the last 3 years, has provided about a third of the supported living accommodation within the totality of the social housing development programme, particularly with a particular emphasis on providing accommodation for people with learning disabilities. Again, Triangle would often provide direct support and care within that accommodation as an organisation. And I suppose what I would like to do is to stress some of the, maybe just re-emphasise some things that have already been said. I think in terms of moving forward, that the review needs to be clear that there has to be an emphasis on strategic needs assessment. It's an area of big challenge, particularly in ensuring that there's integration between the health and social care element and the housing element. So strategic needs assessment is critical moving forward, that it's adequate and that we know what our targets are and what we're trying to achieve. I think also in terms of integration between health and housing, there needs to be a focus on risk sharing housing associations, for example, are finding that quite often where maybe strategic needs assessment has been weak, that the risk of voids and so on has been totally accepted by the housing association, and there's no sharing of voids and so forth with the health trusts, for example. And that's an issue that then makes it very difficult moving forward, planning into the future. So that needs to be taken into account. There have been significant abortive costs around schemes that have actually failed. So that on those abortive costs have been on the part of the housing association, and that's very difficult, especially now because most supported living schemes are a mix of both public and private finance. So that's a difficult area that needs to be taken into account. I think that another area that needs to be considered moving forward is a strategic programme for community engagement and education around supported living accommodation, and we do have issues in regards to understanding of people with learning disabilities and the process of, for example, hospital resettlement, what's involved, and so on. And I think that it's very important that we engage with the communities where people are moving to, and that we would have political support and in that process as well, along with support from the health and social care agencies. I think that finally, just to stress that in terms of the Supporting People programme, the outcomes in our experience have been really very good in terms of especially the hospital resettlement programme, in terms of health and well-being of individuals, in terms of their integration and inclusion in communities, in terms of the development of independent living skills, and the promotion of personal choice in a range of areas. There really has been a significant improvement in the number of individuals' lives. In terms of the hospital resettlement programme, Triangle, for example, has resettled 35 individuals over the last 2 years, and only 2 have had to return at a point to the hospital environment. So there are many success stories out there, but we quite often find that it's the failures that maybe get that get prominence at time. So I think that we need to really focus on the great change that it's making in people's lives. Thank you.
Okay, Chris. Could I ask, just before bringing a number of members, I mean, obviously, Ricky, you've made the point that this has been raised. Some of these issues have been raised quite a few times. I would be very concerned that if we're still hearing that there isn't the kind of coordination between health and housing in terms of our planning, our projections, and so on. So I'd be a bit concerned that still would be the problem. In the context of the Department's review and the policy and legislative framework, do you need to elaborate on any of that there for us? Because you're also dealing with the RQIA and about the regulatory. So I'd just be concerned before we meet the Department that we are fully aware from your side of the argument that what progress, if any, has been made.
Yeah. There are a number of things there. Now, I am assuming not only have you read the evidence paper that was provided to the Minister last week, but that you will have had sight of the earlier consultation documents in regard, particularly the one that was written in regard to commissioning. I think in that paper it became increasingly clear as to why there were concerns over part of the housing budget subsidising the health budget in the delivery of Supporting People programmes, and that was because the actual commissioning structure itself is overwhelmingly populated by the health sector. And I think that that's where we went wrong at the start, Chairman, that we lost sight right at the beginning of the programme that this was a housing-related budget and that it needed to have direction and strategic direction in regard to housing-related tasks, and that where necessary those tasks had to be looking at running in parallel with the strategic direction of health and social care so that they were complementary. But we got unbalanced, and suddenly we had health commissioners with very little understanding of, particularly around capital schemes, very little understanding of what could be produced in terms of individual living, making commissioning decisions for those. But what does concern us in that commissioning paper is that the recommendations do not appear to be, to us, a clawing back of the balance in regard to commissioning to health but rather a transfer of assets to health. And instead of us saying, hold on a wee second, we know what this money's for, the law tells us what this money's for, and we should be commissioning on that basis, but we'd be paying for something else. The solution seems to be to hand that money to health, instead of say to health categorically, and that needs to be done via yourselves, the ministers and the committees, that health needs to pony up. They need to say, right, okay, this is our bit, and you pay for it. And so when we asked you to look at commissioning, we're saying, we think that we agree that the commissioning structure, in terms of its transparency, in terms of strategic need assessment and paying for the right things, need to be tackled. But one of the key ways to tackle that is to ensure the balance is veering towards housing, which is what the programme is for, and that health is complementary but subsidiary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, Chair, at the moment, I think, as Ricky's been saying, I think this is a housing programme being delivered by the health and social care system, and that has outworkings in all sorts of ways. And so we think that just because an individual is vulnerable, I don't think we should hand over responsibility for their housing needs being met to the health and social care system. You know, everyone deserves their own home. And I think that, but in the commissioning and the strategic needs assessment, in issues around risk sharing and paying for schemes, I think the tail is wagging the dog as far as Ricky was saying, in terms of the health and social care system having a huge degree of control on the one hand around SP and particularly the new accommodation-based services, but at the same time not really taking responsibility around things like risk sharing. And so, you know, the Transforming Your Care implementation plan, as far as older people are concerned, makes lots of heroic assumptions about an increasing range of supported housing being available in the community, but they're not really engaging with DSD and the Housing Executive in the way that they should be to ensure that that is delivered. And you have, for example, in new build schemes, the trusts are very much in the lead, and we reckon that often they can be over-specifying the requirements, they're changing scheme design at the last minute, and then, as we said, you know, they're in the lead in allocating to, for example, a new build dementia scheme, and if it takes them 12 or 18 months to populate that scheme, having said that there was need, they're not taking any of the responsibility for the losses that incurs. And I think our QIA on the regulation side, as the health and social care regulator, are really overstepping their regulatory reach in terms of things like again, around issues around scheme design, around determining when and how a scheme can open. Clearly they have an important role as the domiciliary care regulator, but I think they've become a default regulator of supported living in a way that's not appropriate and is not accountable.
Okay, I mean, I'm just reminding our members, because some members have obviously been replaced in recent years on the committee, and we did take a number of quite extensive presentations on this some time ago. In fact, we visited some facilities, and we also held one of our meetings out in the Fold, I think, headquarters in Hollywood. So we've deliberated on this quite a bit, and that's why I was reminding members early on that certainly I'd be concerned that these matters are still here to be unresolved. But anyway, I've just raised that. Dolores, Gregory, and then Fra.
Thanks for your presentation, and I'm sorry if I have to dash off after I do my question for another meeting to go to, but I think, Chair, I'm right in saying that we had representatives from the trade unions on raising the terms and conditions recently, and I'm very concerned to hear a 7-year freeze on pay. Can I ask, in terms of the management costs that are attributable to running supporting people, how much of that is a percentage of the overall budget, and are any of those management costs shared with health and social care, or are they all management costs within your own organisations?
Chris, do you want to answer that, and Deirdre, would you?
I think in terms of management costs within the Supporting People programme, it's I can't answer that question. I think the Supporting People team from the Housing Executive would have to answer what proportion of the element of the 72 are attributed towards management costs. So I can't give you that answer. I'm not sure if, you know, they may have the breakdown for that. What would happen would be, in terms of commissioning process for a scheme, is that the organisations obviously submit the totality of their costs, and that's broken down between management costs and other costs, to deliver the services, and that's incorporated within an overall business plan that's presented to the commissioning body, and then they look at the business plan for the specific scheme and make a decision as to whether it represents value for money. So that is agreed at the outset of each individual project that's presented.
Chair, what I'm really trying to find out, in terms of management costs, has it also been subject to a 7-year freeze?
Are we talking about the housing executive? Sorry,
well, whatever.
Or
whatever and are those costs shared?
Backroom services. From what we can see, the team that is involved within the Northern Ireland Housing Executive in relation to the administration of the programme actually has grown over the years. It has not got less, but the providers of services have got less. And in the case of the contract fee that is given to an individual provider, they have to report back in an extremely detailed way as to what the breakdown of every single element of that money is for, including what time is spent in administrative tasks as well as in service delivery tasks. So for our sector, the provider sector, the split between management and direct service provision is very, very highly monitored, and contracts are based upon cutting that to the minimum. But certainly it is my understanding, in terms of the management costs of the overarching administration of the project, there has been greater investment.
Chair, maybe we could get some of that.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, I mean, it's interesting, but because Dolores had referred to the meeting that we had, so I want to make sure we don't stray into enforcing the problem, because just for the record, the committee, we agreed very recently to put on the committee website apology from the union, who had brought people up here who were staff members and through no fault of their own. That delegation went off on all sorts of tangents, so we did agree that we would on the website put in correspondence apologising on behalf of the union, and also correspondence from, I think it was Trinity Housing Association. I want to place on record through no fault of the individual workers. My opinion, clearly, and I was very annoyed about it, and I stopped the conversation because they were straying into matters that were not pertinent to what they had supposed to have been here for. But I mean, it's a fair point you're asking there, Dolores, about the overall relationship in terms of cuts and what have you, in terms of each organisation. But that's not precisely the agenda we're on today. So but we'll get more information on that if you're happy enough for that.
Yeah, I'm indeed. And just on the RQIA issue, just what are you trying to tell us there in relation to the regulatory framework and the lack of clarity around their role? What difference would that make?
I think that, for example, there is an issue. If you take a supported living project, there are no specific standards for supported living from that regulatory perspective from RQIA, and I think that RQIA themselves recognise that fact. So a supported living project generally comes under the remit of what they call domiciliary care regulations. So the fit is not quite, maybe what it should be. So there's the issue of, should there be a specific set of supported living standards, that would be agreed. But also there's then the issue of over-regulation in the sense of, and the relationship between the different regulators. So we don't need duplication. And I know that has been looked at as a precedent.
Can I just say one thing, a very positive thing, Dolores, that there are a number of schemes that are jointly commissioned between health and housing in relation to young homeless people. And those schemes, understandably, because many of those children will be looked after children, there is a responsibility for REQUIA to ensure that the accommodation they're based in meets all the relevant standards. Now, early on in the process, and it was a really good process that I would hold up, the provider sector were involved from the very start, and REQUIA realised that they could not apply children's home standards to the type of supported living that these young homeless people were living in jointly commissioned schemes. And so they went off with the provider sector and housing, and they wrote a new hybrid model of standards for those particular type of projects, which are now being applied. Now, we're not necessarily doing all that well yet, but we recognise that these are the right standards. They're specific standards for that type of accommodation, and I think maybe that gives an example where we could move forward in terms of regulation and inspection in jointly commissioned schemes.
Yeah, I think in jointly funded schemes, I think that the sense is amongst, I think, a lot of members and providers that RQIA is regulating domiciliary care very differently in a supported living environment than a person's own family home, and that they're perhaps exercising control and influence over all sorts of aspects of the scheme way beyond what might be considered domiciliary care. And I think that RQIA and the DSD have had appropriate concerns about, for example, issues around health and safety, and ensuring that the DSD's QAF inspections are properly aligned with the RQIA's domiciliary care inspections, and that basically vulnerable adults are properly protected. And we agree with all of that. But because supported living is primarily a housing service, we think that the issues in terms of a lack of regulatory standards for supported living should be dealt with primarily by the housing executive as the programme managers and as the regulators effectively through the QAF of the SP programme. We don't think it's appropriate that RQIA has become the supported living regulator by the back door. We just think it's inappropriate.
Okay, thank you. Thank
Okay,
you, Chair.
thank you. Gregory?
Yeah, it was a very good presentation, and each of the four of you, in separate ways, outlined, a range of the services that are able to be offered under supporting people. You used in the briefing paper, there's talk about lack of transparency and dominance of health and social care, and I think it was Zainab Cameron or Ricky used the fear of the subsidising issue that could come about. Some of what I'm going to ask has been answered, but I want to probe a little bit more deeply. Let's assume a transfer did take place, because others would sit where you're sitting.
And recommend it, absolutely.
Yes, and then we're going to look at both those. What are the services that you very eloquently outlined in each of your capacities that you think wouldn't be done under the transfer, and why wouldn't it be done?
I can probably start to answer that. I don't think in any conversations, Gregory, that I've had over the years with officials from the department, there has ever been any suggestion of transferring homelessness services. Because homelessness services, apart from in some very, very small specialised cases, like DePaul, Ireland, in regard to people with addiction problems and Housing First, homelessness services are pure housing services. So if you're in temporary accommodation, in a hostel, or you're receiving floating support in accommodation to prevent homelessness, those services will be all the eligible services that are in the Supporting People legislation and guidance, and they do not get any money from health and social care, so they don't have any money coming in for the providers of homelessness services to do any domiciliary care type activities. They just don't do it. And so that has been recognised that we, as a sector in homelessness, are almost pure supporting people funding. And therefore those services have never been considered. I mean, even at the beginning where they were saying maybe 2/3 of the programme could potentially transfer to health because they were jointly funded schemes, homelessness always sat outside that.
I think the elements that were maybe being put forward then that could be the ones that transfer are perhaps being presented as the supported living schemes that maybe have in financial terms a majority of input from the social care sector. So they may have a combination of supporting people money and then they have health and social care money. But there's in terms of the total package of support and care, it's a majority of health and social care. Now,
providing which services?
That would be providing services to people with learning disabilities, mental health, and so on. But they would be quite high cost schemes.
High levels of domiciliary care. So the health service are providing high levels of domiciliary care alongside the housing support and housing services provided.
But that can be through a provider organisation like Triangle and so on. Again. I would be very, very wary of passing money to health and social care in that context. I think the issue would be that health and social care should be integrated into the commissioning process for what is in essence a housing project. It's a supported living project with domiciliary care, coming in. Because if you pass the commissioning process, if you pass the money to health and social care, you also inevitably must pass the commissioning process, which takes it outside of the existing commissioning process altogether. So what will happen will be that you have the potential to impose, more of a health model on the outcome, the supported living project outcome, than you do at the present time. So, I would certainly argue that health and social care in that instance must be absolutely integrated into the commissioning process along with housing, but the totality of the commissioning process along with the money should not pass to health and social care.
I think for older people, I think if the money was transferred over, I think that understandably the health and social care system have such issues around on the acute side that the more preventative community-based options, they're not, understandably, they're maybe not quite a priority. And I think that providing housing care and support solutions for people with dementia, I just don't think there would be the focus on it, the priority on it, if it were transferred to health and social care. And these are not housing professionals. They know a lot about dementia and about care, but they don't necessarily have the same degree of expertise about what housing is best provided for people with particular needs, including older people with dementia.
Could I just add one thing, Chairman? I have a paper in my possession sent to be my colleague, and it comes from the National Housing Federation, and it is a piece of work that was carried out by the Department of Health in England. And as you know, when people in England lost its ring fencing, and a significant percentage of services went, some were maintained, but many went. And this paper from the Department of Health is speaking to the housing world and saying, in order for us to be able to deliver our strategic health outcomes, there are a number of tasks that we need housing to do for us because we don't have the expertise. It's not within our statutory remit, but they are necessary. And every single one of those tasks are the tasks that were paid for by supporting people. So there are very specific housing-related tasks that help support the health agenda, but if we're going to be commissioning for services that are based within accommodation of whatever type in the community, housing needs to commission those with then the support coming from health, rather than the money go the other way.
It's helpful.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
well, that'd be helpful at some point.
And I can send you that paper if I send it to Kevin.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful. Fran McCann then, Roy.
Thanks for the presentation. It was interesting, and the more you think things change, the more you realise that things just stand still. Because I remember going back, and I'm probably on the committee here from the start, and listening to a number of presentations, especially about in the inflationary freeze and the RQA. And it's amazing sometimes the services can still be delivered within them confines. There's just a couple of questions. One is in relation to the competitive tendering process being operated in England, and you've been fairly critical of that, and on quite a number of things. Have you done any research yourselves into the competitive tendering process and the impact that it has had, the follow-on impact by private companies coming in to take over those tenders?
In regards to the outcomes of the procurement process, the procurement process, and particularly the focus on competitive tendering, I think there is some useful work being done within the context of the Supporting People Review by the Department at the present time. It has some significant research into the outcomes in Scotland, England and Wales in regards to the competitive tendering procurement process. It's by no means all positive. There may be some instances of value for money if gains in some parts, other parts of the UK, in some instances, particularly around new projects. But on the whole, there have also been a lot of negative outcomes in regards to that procurement process. So the Supporting People Review itself is looking into the outcomes of procurement processes in other parts of the UK and will report on that.
I had a conversation with Stephen Martin, who's running out the review yesterday, about the issue of competitive tendering and how in the evidence paper they say that there are some really good examples. The reality is there is one good example that they have found within their review where competitive tendering has actually been extremely beneficial. And I think the conversation that we would be having within the sector is we need to be looking more closely at those examples in that comprehensive research that they're carrying out and see what it was that made the ones that were successful work and what it was that made the ones that were not successful and actually ended up with a drive to the bottom and a lowering of standards and of quality and of actually meeting the requirements of the framework itself, and work with the sector and with yourselves to be saying what elements of competitive tendering do we need to bring into Northern Ireland if we are going to do it that are effective. I don't think that there is a complete negativity within the provider sector in regard to competitive tendering, but there is if we're not looking for quality as well as value for money. You know, if we just go for money, what we end up is that, an example that I heard in England where the tender was won, and how it was won was that they made redundant all their existing staff. They brought in bank staff who they paid the minimum wage to, that they said we no longer needed qualifications, that staff only needed to be good with people, and they only needed to be good with people for 14 minutes a week. Now, I don't think that that's the kind of competitive tendering we want to be setting.
To be fair to the department, I think they are taking a sensible approach here. I mean, obviously, you know, there are issues around compliance with the local procurement policy, but I think they're suggesting that we'll take an incremental approach in this and try maybe 3 pilots on competitive tendering for new SP services in Northern Ireland. And I think if it's framed in the right way and there's a proper balance of cost and quality, and you know issues around ensuring good quality staff and all the rest of it, then perhaps it might have a role. But I think what we would obviously want to avoid at all costs is all services going out to competitive tendering and having this race to the bottom on cost, which has happened in England.
Sure. Just to follow a couple of other questions, and I don't know why it'd be worthwhile asking our research department even to look into the competitive tendering process as it's been rolled out in England. They equip us with some of the information. Obviously, in the report you've been fairly critical of the housing executive inspections around quality, consistency and general approach. And again, on the other hand, RQIA. And ideally, what would you like to see there in terms of how you deal with inspections? And I suppose sometimes if you have 2 or 3 different organisations carrying out similar process, you know, you'll get 3 different reports on it.
Deirdre, do you want to talk a bit about the QAF?
Yeah, I think that there needs to be a consistent approach across services, and there needs to be a standard set as to what should be expected across all services. And the quality assessment framework that Supporting People implement across all of the homeless services and certainly all of the other services that they inspect and that they fund is a very robust inspection and audit process where they look at all aspects of the actual service delivery, and that's to the service delivery to the actual service user, which at the end of the day should not be lost in all of this, and everybody deserves to have that respect and the quality of service that we would all expect. And so they examine that aspect of it. They examine where how the money has been spent and the budget management and the cost, and obviously then the impact that the service has in order to move people on and out of, certainly I can speak from the homeless sector, out of homelessness and back into a community setting, which is a much more cost-effective way for anybody to live. And then you have to not forget the impact that that has in the communities themselves when people get back into employment and education and reintegration back into family settings. So that quality assessment framework is robust as it sits, and as long as there's consistency of appliance of that across all of the services that they fund, then I feel there's aspects of it, yes, we could tweak and make better, but it's working very effectively as it sits, and it is monitoring what should be monitored within the framework of where supported housing sits within housing and the support services, and not necessarily in health.
I think we must also recognise that in the nature of the services that we described earlier on, there are the kind of the homelessness services, there are the pure housing services, that traditionally can be viewed that way. There then are the schemes that have significant health and social care in terms of finance, for maybe some high dependency individuals, and our QIA's role, for example, in that area, quite adds significant value at times, in terms of its input. But I think they themselves would probably recognise that not having a specific supported living framework in which to regulate presents issues, because they're using domiciliary care regulations in that environment. And I think, on the positive side, the QAF has a very significant input, obviously, and particularly on the schemes that don't have care input. RQIA is then coming in on the care side. Sometimes there's overlap, but there's a recognition of the fact that RQIA could have and does have a very positive impact, but coordination, the lack of duplication, and having a very clear agreed supported living context in which to regulate is absolutely critical. And I don't get the sense there's any disagreement across the agencies who do the regulation in that area. It just seems that we've struggled to gain the outcome of actually delivering in that area.
Sorry, thanks, Chair. I mean, I think I wrote those comments on the approach. So if I can just clarify, I mean, I think generally a lot of our members are happy with the QAF. I think I think accept and support what DSD and the Housing Executive are trying to do to shift the balance of the QAF away from compliance with process and contract management procedures more towards outcomes for service users, and try and frame it more in that way. And I think that is correct. I think maybe there's been I think quite a lot of turnover within the Supporting People team, and I think maybe some very experienced members of that team have moved on. And I think there was a sense amongst one or two of our members that some new inspectors who've gone out to do the QAF from the Housing Executive have maybe taken quite a compliance-based approach, where it's been more about fault finding and feeling like it's nitpicking rather than working with the provider to improve services. And there have been one or two things around process, for example, where individuals in SP-funded schemes have been contacted, just cold called almost by inspectors without any warning or explanation. And also people who are self-funders in supported housing schemes who don't receive any funding from SP being expected to open up their home and give account to the QAF inspectors, where there's no actual SP money going in. So there are some issues about ensuring consistency and quality in the QAF, and also, but I think that in general the reframing towards outcomes for service users is an approach that we support.
Sure, just one final thing, and it's in around community engagement, which I believe is crucial. And as I know that many of the new schemes that are provided, they're excellent. They get better. The facilities get better, and the people that they cater for enjoy them better than some of the but the way that health and the social services handle the transition from one scheme to another in many ways leaves a lot to be the desire, and sometimes it causes more difficulties within communities than the thing. So it's how you would engage with communities. I know that there's one in West Belfast that's closing, and within the next 2 years there'll be a home for people with mental health built in. And I know the community I live in and represent are very supportive of it. But that's not always the case. And there's a need there to get in right away and talk to people and make them part of any development that's going to be in. And how would you do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is critical. I think it's also, though, finding the balance and having a realism about what can and can't be shared with communities. So I think that communities, for example, understanding the risk assessment process that takes place, for example, around an individual moving from hospital to community, but a community also understanding that, you know, personal details and individuals cannot be shared. There's a privacy issues that those individuals, their families and so forth, you know, there's things that can't be shared around individuals, but understanding that there is a formalised, structural and multi-agency, you know, process of risk assessment of moving from hospital to community and so on that takes place, that there is a very clear opportunity for the community to engage with the provider on an ongoing basis, that they know who to contact, and so on is critical. It's quite often there have been we've had experience of individual schemes. Maybe it's only one house in a community where a scheme has had to be aborted because the community wants to know the detail of who's moving into the house. Now, the house has not been changed or altered in any way at all, and obviously none of us know who our neighbours are going to be, you know, in a house, in one house that's next to us, and some information can't be shared and shouldn't be shared. You know, there's privacy issues, but issues around how the risk assessment process is carried out, who the agencies are providing support and care in the accommodation and how they can be contacted, and also how those agencies will, on an ongoing basis, engage with the local community, can be dealt with. And we have to find a balance, because there are individual schemes that have had to be aborted because communities have not been accepting of the fact. No.
Sorry if I may, in our Housing First service, which is quite a challenging service because it's supporting the most chronic and people with chronic alcohol issues and complex needs, and supporting them to live independently in a community. And those are the individuals that are from the community. And really the aim for that is really to ensure that the proper housing is identified in the first instance, and that requires a lot of discussion and consultation with both the housing providers, be it in the private rented sector or the statutory sector, and within community groups very often as well, to ensure that when someone is going into the community, that there is an integration process and plan in place for that individual, that it's not a question of setting them into a house and forgetting about them, so that there's the wraparound services in place for them. So that's the use and utilisation of all services that's available, because it's not one person's responsibility, it's a community's responsibility. So it's about engaging everybody together in that consultation process.
You want to bring in Roy now? Thank you.
Okay. Again, thanks for your presentation. Certainly I would agree with your idea around best value. It shouldn't be a drive to the minimum price contract at all costs, and that must be avoided. You mentioned that the English Health Service had produced an interesting paper which is supportive of supporting people and supportive housing. Can you advise us how is supportive housing structured in England, Wales, Scotland, elsewhere? I mean, which department takes the lead, or is this crossover that we have? Because that seems to be creating some difficulty.
They're all slightly different. In England, what was the supporting people budget sat within local authorities and was the responsibility of individual local authorities to administer, and that made sense because local authorities in England, as you know, have responsibilities for both housing and for social care. That has gone completely, and in a number of, the ring fence went, in a number of local authorities, that money was completely absorbed and spent in other budgets. And we have one very classic example where in the Isle of Wight they built roads with it, and 37 services closed completely and were not reinstated. In other local authorities, they have recognised that there is a need for housing related support, and they have a budget that is set aside for that. But there are no local authorities within England which have not had a cut in the number of services that were provided once the ring fencing was gone, because local authorities there, just as here, have multiple pressures on them, and very often have to have reactive pressures. Within Wales, Wales has kept a ring fence supporting people budget, but it has always been different in that part of the strategic direction of supporting people and funding sits within the Welsh Assembly government, and part of it sits within local authorities. The local authority budgets within supporting people this year have been cut by 10 million, but they still protect supporting people services, and they are co-jointly delivered. In Scotland, they have a different model altogether. In Scotland, they lost the supporting people ring fence as well as England. But Scotland, being Scotland, were slightly more progressive and made some moves in order to mitigate the negative impact. And so they developed a new model which brings that money that wasn't supported, part of the money that was within supporting people, in under the umbrella of social care, but social care commissions for both housing and social care. So it's not sitting within health trusts as our money would, it sits within a very distinct body that administers this. But in Scotland also, and if we speak to our colleagues, there was a significant loss of services. They have managed as best they can through collaborative and partnership working to be able to maintain as much as they can of those services, but I think around about 30% of services that were there have been lost and have not been replaced, and that there has been in each of those jurisdictions an impact upon the public purse. A negative impact upon the public purse, never mind people's lives.
The impact in England of the removal of the ring fence and just the disappearing of that money, it has had a lot of significant consequences. And for example, in homelessness, the rates of homelessness in England are just skyrocketing because we're not investing in those preventative community-based services. So everything just gets to the crisis point.
Okay.
And in terms of this report from England, as that indicated, the significant costs that basically have to appear somewhere else.
The report from England, I will send it to you. Now, it is research conducted by Health, and what they are saying is that it's not even the amount of impact that would be on our accident and emergency and perhaps residential facilities. What it is saying is that there are significant preventative impacts for housing-related support that support health. So, for example, we heard yesterday that for elderly people who are living in the community, loneliness and lack of community integration has the same health impact on those elderly people as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So what Health are saying is that if you want to protect people from strokes potentially, from heart attacks, from mental health problems, that low-level support that is housing support, that isn't domiciliary care in the community, has a positive impact. And Health are saying, but we can't commission for that because it's not a direct health service, it's a health impact that comes from housing.
Certainly, when a member of the Health Committee, I visited Cedar Court in Downpatrick, a very impressive development there, and one which the residents really appreciated and were very supportive of. And thankfully there's a new development. The sod was just cut yesterday at Green Island House in my own constituency, which I think is following that model. But you mentioned earlier this issue of risk in terms of developing new facilities such as this. And when I was in discussion with some of the Housing Association members yesterday, I was curious as to how is this risk element being catered for and planned, because I'm aware Fold Housing have lost over £1 million in the Enniskillen development. So my question is, I was pleased that Green Island is going ahead. Are you aware of others that are being held back because of concern of risk factors?
Yeah, I think Chris can come into this. I think there are risks in two areas. One is I think that the triangle I've suffered from is around working up new schemes where the trust think there might be and the housing executive think there might be a need for a particular scheme in a particular area, and the housing association can do a lot of work at its own risk, getting in consultants and architects and working it up at a high level, and then the trust can chop and change what they think is required, and then RQIA might put their tuppence worth in about they want changes, and then the scheme might either be completely reconfigured at the last minute, incurring lots of other costs, or abandoned by the trust may just say, well, actually, after all this work, we don't think we're going to go ahead with it now for whatever reason. And the housing association is left having carried the baby of incurred 30, 40, 50,000 pounds worth of abortive costs. But there's also the risk element on the revenue side. Once the facility is up and running, that actually it may take, in the case of a dementia scheme, 12 or 18 months to populate, and there's lots of void losses being incurred, or there may just be it may just have been the trust may just have, for example, misread the need, and I think that in one or two trusts, I think there have been examples in the South Eastern Trust where actually the South Eastern Trust have been prepared to actually share risk, and we appreciate social businesses. We do have to take some of the risk, but the trust and the South Eastern Trust have taken some of the risks. But lots of other trusts, and I think including the Northern Trust, are not prepared to. And I know of one case where in Ballycastle, where I think Clanmill felt, they were negotiating with the Northern Trust for months and months and months about trying to get a fair sharing of risk. In the end, the Northern Trust wouldn't budge, and that Clanmill walked away, having put a lot of time and effort into that supported living scheme for older people. I think in that case, I think another association did actually step in, but there is an example there of an association wasting a lot of time and money because of the lack of risk sharing. And if the South Eastern Trust can do it, why can't the Department of Health, the board, just say, well, we're going to have a regional approach? I think it's a real concern for Triangle, I think.
But I think generally that, there is a lack of consistency. Some trusts do, some trusts don't. There are regionalised, what are called regionalised contracts issued for services that are actually being provided. But, for example, some trusts will accept some liability for voids. So, for example, if the trust has the referral responsibility to the unit, they will say, if we can't fill it within 3 months, we will pay a certain percentage element. There's different arrangements for different types of projects. Other trusts just say, no, there are no void payments at all. We will attempt to fill the vacancy as soon as we can. And it comes down to individual negotiation, with the trust, and you get a variety of approaches. And I think that it's so there's that aspect of it. There's the aspect of within those contracts, there's no formalised agreements with regard to sharing of start-up costs or abortive costs. In the instance of where maybe an association had taken the scheme right through planning and so forth, and then suddenly the strategic needs assessment might change, the business case isn't passed through the commissioning process. The detailed business case, obviously the initial outline business case that has gone through the process, and the association's left with a board of costs for the consultancy fees, its own time, and so on and so on. And it's around those issues where a consistency of approach, or we understand, it's been said, we are in the process and we have to accept an element of that risk, but we are social businesses, and going forward, you can't accept all of the risk. It's not going to stack up financially.
Can I just add one thing, and I think it brings us back to almost where we started, and this is to do with the commissioning of services. And I know that there is a feeling within the housing association movement, who own most of the property, the accommodation bases for accommodation delivered services, that if Health is commissioning, Health commission for very specialist areas, and they very often commission a very specific type of building that is not necessarily appropriate for change of use or for meeting easily if Health eventually find out that they can't populate these buildings. And therefore, one of the things we're saying is we need to bring commissioning back into housing, because that's where housing expertise is, that we look at housing associations saying we can design a model that will be able to accommodate different types of client group, should there not be the need either now or in the future for the specific group that Health have identified a need. And I think that that's one of the things that we would be very keen when we're talking about commissioning in terms of supporting people funding.
And just finally then, my sense is that at the minute the schemes proceed having gone through a detailed scrutiny and business case assessment by the Health Trust, and yet they do not really put much into the risks that the housing associations are really required to carry. That certainly in the Northern Trust, it seems to be that risk is passed, and certainly in the case of Enniskillen, the risk was passed to the housing associations who developed the scheme, and the trust just walked away. Oh, we changed our plans, or we changed or got our business case wrong, or whatever. Is that a fair assessment of where it is?
You get a variety of, it's not fair to say that all trusts act in that manner, but there are examples of individual schemes within individual trusts, and there are other examples where the trust has engaged in some risk sharing and sharing of start-up costs. But there's not a consistent approach, and in some instances, yes, housing associations have been left with the totality of the risk.
Yeah, and I think Hemsworth Court is a good example. I mean, it's a very successful scheme off the Shankill. Helm are working well with the Belfast Trust in doing that, and it's now fully populated and it's working well. But spending 12 or 18 months getting it populated means that Helm have incurred hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of losses on it through no fault of their own, and you can't. Basically, boards won't accept too many of those before they say, these are just too risky. Much as we'd like to do more of them, these are just too risky unless we have that fair sharing of risk.
Okay, I'm going to have to move on because we've another presentation, some statutory rules. Stuart, are you looking under?
Just briefly, to follow on from that point, at the end of the day, it is a two-way street. They're not going to be able to provide them accommodation themselves. You are the provider. To what extent can you negotiate with them, and therefore, for example, in relation to voids, simply say that after a vacancy period of X, then we will charge you rent? And if you do that away back at the building stage, they either get their building or they don't get their building.
Yeah, I think there is a learning curve for us, and that we expect, and I think we can try to do that. Obviously, in some instances, the trust will say no. There's no sharing of that, and the association has to make a call from its boards. Will make a call on whether the risk is worth sharing. But many of us, it's what we're here to do. It's what we're about, but we will have to gauge that risk. Some I think in the movement are seriously questioning whether they can go forward at all with such type schemes. Others, are fully committed to it and want to move forward, but want it in a fair framework.
I think looking ahead to the next programme for government and spending period, I think if the health and housing departments work more closely together on joint bids for provision over the next 4 years, then hopefully the capital and revenue, both on the health and housing side, can be better aligned, so that these issues are much less acute, because actually proper money has been set aside by both departments to deliver the schemes that are required.
Thank you.
I was just going to make that point there. I mean, obviously we've taken a number of notes from this discussion this morning, and it's an ongoing discussion. So we do have a presentation on the 25th. Are there any kind of final remarks you want to make this morning? Because I know we will be dealing with your expertise again after we talk to the department.
I suppose in conclusion we would say we never asked to come and talk to you without us asking for something. And it was what we're asking for is that under the review you do keep in mind that we really do in Northern Ireland need this programme, that the review should not be used as a mechanism whereby to either transfer money or to reduce the programme. The programme in overall terms, as you know, is a very small amount of money. I mean, 72 million isn't vast in terms of the overall budget within the programme for government. And that we as a sector are always very, very willing to compromise, to work in partnership, to work on what the recommendations are so that it's of value to both service users and to the strategic targets. And that we would ask that, the review you keep in mind that we will do that and we will work with you, but that we do need this programme.
Okay, well, I mean, just for the record, the committee has supported in terms of the department planning plans the continuation of the ring-fenced funding for the programme. Okay, so can we leave that for this morning? So look, thanks very much for the very comprehensive presentation and responses you've provided to the members this morning. And as always, we're very, very keen to hear from your own particular expertise, and we'll continue to engage with you on that basis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, members. The next item, obviously, is a departmental briefing on the evaluation of the neighbourhood renewal strategy. I'm a wee bit concerned in case we lose a quorum. We have two statutory rules we want to deal with. Can I ask, just with your indulgence, we move the 2 statutory rules first of all, in case we end up without a quorum? Okay. So, it'll take a minute or two. So, the SL1, Occupational Pension Schemes, Charges and Governance Regulations, that's on page 40 of your pack. Corresponding Great Britain statutory instrument came into force on 6th of April 2015, and the rule should be made. Is the committee content for the rule to be made?
Great.
Okay, thank you for that. Item 9, the Social Security in relation to reciprocal arrangements. Page 47, you'll find that on your pack. Okay, so is the committee content for the rule to be made?
Great.
Great, okay, members, thank you very much for that. In terms of correspondence, are members content then to action the correspondence outlined in the memo, page 63 of your pack?
Great.
Okay, members, thank you for that. And the forward work programme, members content to note the forward work programme? Okay, is there anything else under anything AOB, if anybody wants to raise?
Yes. I just want to ask, I read some speculation somewhere about Meg's White Buddy. Has the committee any information on that?
Other than I was advised by the Minister last week that she had tendered a resignation, and as I understand, that was accepted.
Chair, there was a press release from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive on Friday that was released about that.
Yeah.
It's just to say that she has tendered a resignation. There's no indication of how long she's going to continue to work for the organisation, but that to be a process of recruitment and followed to follow.
Her post was, she was still officially the interim chief executive, was she?
Yeah.
So they haven't activated the process of appointing a chief executive?
No, because I mean, the conversation I had with the Minister, in fairness, he gave me a call before the thing went public just to give me a heads up as the chair of the committee. I probably should have added that in this more moderate horizon, but he just advised then that she had apparently tendered her resignation and that had been accepted, and that obviously a consideration going forward would have to be on the basis of whether or not to be like just a full-time, full appointment, or whether it be another interim. I think people are veering towards a full-time appointment, but I mean, that's obviously would have to be the consideration of the Minister going forward. So okay for that. But I just again, we have a letter of resignation from the Assembly from Mickey Brady.
Yes, tabled items.
Some tabled items. This is why I asked him to leave early on. He actually had his resignation was operational from yesterday, the 3rd. So in your table item there, we have a letter just from the committee thanking Mickey for his contribution over the years. He's been a member of the committee since 2007, if I remember correctly. So members can hand in, we record our thanks to him for his contribution.
The letter actually indicated his intention to resign, so he has actually resigned.
Yes.
Didn't actually said he had resigned.
Yeah, that's it. He wasn't sure himself exactly when the date would actually apply from, but that's been resolved.
He didn't see the table papers, even there was something wrong.
And any suggestion that the committee meetings will be a lot shorter in future, I wouldn't dare comment on it. But he has been a very valuable member of the committee's expertise, particularly in relation to welfare and benefit issues, been very, very important. Okay, so can we return then to the agenda while we still have ourselves here? So again, could I formally welcome the department officials, Barbara McGreed, John Johnson, Chris Hughes. Could I thank yourselves for attending the committee this morning. And you're going to brief the committee on the evaluation of the neighbourhood renewal strategy. So again, thanks very much. As you can see, I was skipping through other parts of the agenda in case we lose a quorum. So there's no indication that we will, but so Chris, if you want to take the lead or whoever.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to brief the committee. I was going to make some opening remarks, and then, if you were content, we would take questions.
Yep.
So, the strategy is coming to an end, so obviously it's time for us to carry out an evaluation of the neighbourhood renewal strategy. It's an independent evaluation which was carried out by McClure Waters, and what we asked for was a very robust evaluation that would allow us to draw out particularly lessons learned. The terms of reference covered 3 areas. First, to assess the impact of neighbourhood renewal. Secondly, to look at the effectiveness of how it was delivered. And finally, to look at lessons learned for councils going forward under the auspices of community planning. Neighbourhood renewal was launched in 2003 as a 10-year strategy. It was about government departments and local people working together, and it targeted the 10% most deprived wards through 36 neighbourhood renewal areas. So it had 4 aims, which was community, economic, social and physical renewal. It had an annual budget of 20 million, which is 0.2 of the block grant in its entirety. So that was revenue. And it was always viewed that this was additional money to mainstream funding. In the neighbourhood renewal strategy at the outset, it was made clear that the needs of areas where mainstream delivery was always seen as the mainstream way of meeting the foundations of neighbourhood renewal. So this was a little bit of extra money in additional to the services that would come in through health and education and the other statutory providers. It also had a capital budget of on average £7 million per year. So over the total course of the period up until this evaluation, Neighbourhood Renewal spent just under £200 million across that period of time, which was 120 revenue and 75 capital. There was an issue on the baseline. If members have the page 2 of the executive summary, the department does recognise that there should have been a robust baseline from the outset. The consultants felt that this meant that the assessment of the performance at a programme level had been undermined. This issue was picked up in the mid-term review of the strategy, and it was addressed at that point, but it wasn't there from the outset. Now, that was at a programme level, but there was robust monitoring at a project level underneath it. On page 2 then, take you down through each row of the table. On looking at providing the best possible services, the evaluation found that a lack of engagement from key statutory agencies meant that this wasn't achieved. It was an ambitious goal, but it wasn't achieved. Neighbourhood Renewal didn't close the gap, but it did, which was another aim, but it did improve indicators from baseline across many indicators. And it actually notified that there's a high level of pride for people living in neighbourhood renewal areas. On improved environment, this delivered significant improvements, and one of the interesting pieces of evidence that came out through the course of the evaluation was that the Housing Executive note that there is now demand to live in neighbourhood renewal areas, whereas previously there would have been vacancies and derelict sites. So actually there's been quite a turnaround in people's attitudes towards living in these areas. On closing the gap in quality of life, this was a challenging target. Closing a gap is always a challenging target, and Neighbourhood Renewal did not substantially close the gap, even though there were improvements across the indicators. Now, the gap didn't close between the Neighbourhood Renewal areas and those that were the more affluent ones outside. So, as I said, it did improve some indicators. Education improved, and we know that improved education actually can have a positive outcome on other aspects of people's quality of life, for example, employment and health outcomes. There was a considerable decrease in the percentage of working age with no qualifications, down from 55 to 41%. On economic and crime indicators, the evidence of change was mixed, and it didn't improve health indicators over the life of the strategy, except for reducing the number of births to teenage mothers. On page 3, targeting the most acute deprivation, the approach was seen as appropriate, and it did identify the most deprived areas. However, respondents said that they found that the neighbourhood renewal areas were often seen as too small to do effective interventions, and not always coterminous with what people would have viewed as natural communities. It was influenced by the shape of the wards. Other strategies in other different parts of the world have taken a combined approach where they look at both geographical and thematic approach, which actually means that the boundaries aren't so flexible. On taking a long-term view, the plan was long-term, it was launched in 2003, but funding was short-term, which caused a problem. So there were budget uncertainties and short funding cycles, which the community groups and people found, although the view it didn't fit with the funding cycles. And there wasn't sufficient monitoring and evaluation to identify and share best practice, although this has been strengthened since the mid-term review. On taking an integrated approach, there was a perceived lack of buy-in from key statutories and a perceived lack of integration with local action plans. The statutories would have made the point that there was uncertainty around RPA, which made it difficult for them to commit across the period of the strategy, and also the statutories would have identified budget pressures as being an issue. On page 4, addressing community divisions, the lack of the baseline means that the strategy's impact cannot be robustly assessed. Residential segregation in Northern Ireland mean that most of the neighbourhood renewal areas were by and large all single identity, and they were inward looking, so they weren't required to look across to other neighbourhood renewal areas. But at times of social unrest, which occurred sporadically throughout the course of the strategy since 2003, the partnership model continued to work, and what it did was it kept open engagement between communities on both sides whenever there were times of social unrest. So that had a stabilising effect. On working in partnership, the partnership took a while to bed in, but is now working very well, and it would have been probably more effective from the outset if the code of practice had been in place early enough. Empowering local communities, there was a very high level of engagement across consultation and engagement with communities, which also helped develop the capacity of the communities within the neighbourhood renewal areas, and it also stimulated volunteering opportunities. On page 5, making a difference, the lack of late baseline data has resulted in an inability to determine the full impact of neighbourhood renewal, but the project level measurement of activities and outputs was in place from the outset. At programme level, it is harder to attribute change directly to neighbourhood renewal, as mainstream services and societal issues have a major effect on the indicators. For example, we had a major economic downturn from 2007-2008, and that it has an impact on society and employment levels, and particularly if you're in neighbourhood renewal areas where people are in, for example, construction work or something like that. It can actually, regardless of the programme, major events can have a major outside the control of the programme. And there's been progress across 3 of the 4 strategic objectives, but on community, social and physical. But there was more needed, particularly around economic activity. On delivery in challenging times, which is the bit in the text, the consultants did note that there were challenging elements around the environment in which we were delivering neighbourhood renewal. There was on-off local government, the economic climate, budget uncertainty for the programme, sporadic periods of social unrest, coming and going of devolution, and the challenge about getting some partnerships to work together. So in conclusion, the principle of focusing resources on those areas most in need was widely accepted as being appropriate. The size of some areas was too small. The partnership model was effective once it got established. There was high level of community engagement, which did develop community capacity within areas. And at times of social unrest, the partnership approach had a stabilising effect. One particular success was the physical improvements, where people made them much more attractive and much more for people to live. And in fact, the mid-term review found that the population in neighbourhood renewal areas had declined. But by the time of this final evaluation, the population had actually increased from the baseline, so people were moving back in it, which is consistent with the Housing Executive findings about being attractive for people to live in. And finally, the evaluation is important as it provides a robust assessment of area-based interventions, and in particular, on pages 7 to 10, it provides lessons learned for councils going forward as they look to get the regeneration powers extended to them and actually implement community planning. So.
Okay, Chris, I mean, fair play for galloping literally through all that. It's very comprehensive and detailed, actually, and certainly provoked a lot of interesting questions. You just, on your last point there, in terms of how this relates to local government, as they take on these powers, could you maybe elaborate a little bit more before bringing other members?
Yes, I mean, as members are acutely aware, the bill has finished its committee stage, and the next stage is the consideration stage. So the department, the powers will be extended to the councils, and they will then have the responsibility for undertaking regeneration within their areas. The idea being that local people are best placed to respond to the local government is best placed to respond to local need. The department has undertaken to support the councils as best we can. We're going to be providing best practice guidance to them and information on the indicators about areas, the kind of statistical information that we would have used, which helped us identify the need in areas and we've developed the NISR have developed the NINA system, which is a very comprehensive snapshot across a range of health, education, community indicators, which will help inform the councils about what the areas of need are and what the types of need are in their areas.
Okay, Chris, thanks for that. Jim?
You've tried to present this report as positively as you can, but in truth, it's not happy reading for the department, is it?
Aspects of it are, I mean, certainly I think the one issue is the baseline issue. The fact that you're not able to prove it was good doesn't necessarily mean it was bad. There were a lot of positive things in it, but it was intended to be a robust assessment where we had an independent look, and the point was to try and tease out particularly the lessons learned. So.
Well, I think when you're spending public money of the magnitude of 200 million, you wouldn't expect anything but a robust review. But when it reaches findings of Ike, that the overall aim, this was the overall aim of the project, was to close the gap between the NRAs and the rest of society, and it didn't substantially have an impact. When you have findings that there was no significant progress in relation to economic renewal, you have findings that there was no integrated approach, it's hard to consider a lot of success here. Like, the fundamental question is, was the 200 million value for money?
As I said at the outset, the amount of money that was spent on neighbourhood renewal was 0.2% of the annual block grant, and it always was recognised that a lot of those indicators. 200
million.
Absolutely, it's 200 million. It's a substantial amount of money, but I mean it's 10 billion per year, so which goes into the block grant, which is also substantial money. And I did say at the outset that we recognised that some of these indicators weren't directly within the gift of neighbourhood renewal. We were trying to provide services to the most marginalised, but the Department of Education was spending 2 billion a year on education across Northern Ireland. There are other major players, and on the economic indicators in particular, the fact is that we had a major recession, the worst in living memory, which seriously hampered. Had we been having an expanding economy, that might have been different.
But you had a mid-term review.
We did.
Presumably the mid-term review picked up that there wasn't an integrated approach. But did anything change?
The issue there is that the departments, there was a feeling across the neighbourhood renewal partnerships that the key statutories weren't always as engaged as they could have been. But I think that was still the feeling of the end.
What was the outworking? What was the practical positive impact of the mid-term review?
The mid-term review introduced baselining from, it went back and filled in as far as possible the baselines that were available back to 2004, 2003, so that we could see the progress. But because it wasn't done at the time, it was difficult to attribute cause and effect. It also introduced the codes of practice.
Yes, we introduced a code of practice for the partnerships, which was around the roles and responsibilities for all of those that sat on the partnerships. That included the statutory bodies as well. We also introduced, as Chris said, we introduced an evidence base. We also introduced annual reports which looked at the outputs that were being achieved within the neighbourhood renewal areas for the expenditure that was being put into them. So there was quite a lot was taken forward from the mid-term review.
But you still arrive at a final report which talks about a lack of meaningful engagement from key statutory agencies, despite what you say you did at the mid-term review, which talks about a lack of an integrated approach. It didn't seem to pick itself up or improve very much.
There is an issue about whenever you're looking at mainstream departmental funding, each of those departments has a minister, and those ministers have their priorities and their processes through which they will make decisions. There is an element of the way that statutory agencies can work is that they can tend to operate in silos. I mean, silos can happen even within departments, but when you're looking you're getting into an area where you were trying for a very ambitious outcome, which was getting people to cooperate, but recognising that the reality is that you had different departments with different departmental priorities and different processes for approving expenditure, which had to identify.
You need an integrated approach.
Which,
and you end up with a final report which says you didn't get it.
Neighbourhood renewal wasn't able to deliver the integration across the entire executive that would have probably made things more effective. I think that's
and was that a failure at executive level or at ministerial level within this department of not driving it hard enough?
I'm not sure it was a failure. I think it was just a recognition of the fact that the institutions got up. They were finding their way about how to work together, and it was a reflection of the fact that we were.
Or was it just always bit of a pie in the sky.
It was ambitious. I would certainly grant you that. And I mean, I would take, you mentioned earlier about the ambition to close the gap. Closing the gap is an incredibly difficult thing to do, because whenever you get improvements, it tends to be that those people who are furthest away from achieving, for example, are the ones who are slowest to respond. For example, whenever we looked at the education, the improvements in education, the people who improved first were the Catholic girls who didn't take free school meals, and then the Catholic boys who didn't take free school meals, and the final ones to start to improve sort of years after are the Protestant boys entitled to free school meals. So there is an issue where a rising tide doesn't raise all boats equally. There are some people who are in a position to respond better, and so whenever there was an economic downturn, you had people in neighbourhood renewal areas who were probably more vulnerable to that downturn than other areas, people who were less affected by it. So it was an ambitious target, there is no doubt about it, and it wasn't one that we achieved, but we did achieve improvement across some of the indicators.
Yeah. But the bottom line is that at the end of all this, there's little change in the top of the 50 most deprived wards.
There has been 8 have moved. I mean, you're always working here with the recognition that these are measures of relative deprivation. So if you go back to the measures of deprivation in the past, they would have been looked at things like whether you had an inside toilet and central heating. And nowadays we're looking at, do you have access perhaps to broadband or a fast internet connection. So things have improved in the areas a lot.
Is that how you were testing?
No, I'm just saying that it's the issue about relative deprivation. Whenever you have relative deprivation, you will always have a bottom 10%. Now, in fact, though, across the period of the thing, 8 wards did move out, and looking at the neighbourhood renewal areas, 23, which is of the wards, became relatively less deprived. 5 stayed the same. So you had actually 56% of the wards improved their relative ranking.
But the independent review, that's what the department says. The independent review by McClure Waters puts in black and white. A review of the relative measures of deprivation shows there's been little change in the top 50 most deprived urban wards.
16%.
Yeah. 16% of the population.
Thank you.
I mean, just following on that, before bringing Fran and Roy, I mean, it always frustrates me to no end that what you end up with is, at the moment, probably a more negative narrative. And I would be suggesting for 1 second that you would mask any of the actual realities, but it's what you're comparing with. So you end up with a narrative which says nobody ever does anything for us, but when in actual fact there's millions of pounds, 200 million actually, has gone in this particular project. And probably like most other representatives around the table, I would have been very frustrated over the years that other departments were not buying into the process at a proper time, and maybe a lot of other departments were doing a lot of good work themselves, but it was never really dovetailed, it wasn't strategic, it wasn't joined up, which I always thought was a very, very serious frustration. But to suggest that an area hasn't improved relative to where it was 20 or 25 years ago, it's just ridiculous. I mean, but that's what you end up whenever these reports are commissioned, and I think they have to highlight all that. But I think they need to be presented also in a way that, like when I look around different areas, it's just incomparable today, the standard of life, thankfully. And that's not to minimise difficulties that really do exist, and we've already had a presentation in the last half an hour more before you come in on other issues, supporting people programmes, for example, which highlights a lot of vulnerable people out there. But just making a point that, I think it is important we also contextualise these reports as well, that when you're comparing 20 or 30 years ago in some areas, it's just dramatically different, thankfully, with the work of some of these projects. And I would shudder to think, had you not had these programmes, where communities might have been left. Fran and Roy.
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. And I actually remember back to when the neighbourhood renewal was being proposed, and I have to say at that stage, you were concerned that it was just another programme that was being going to be delivered, and that it would have no impact on the communities. And I think one of the things that attracted certainly myself at the time was for the first time to talk about a coordinated approach in dealing with social deprivation. And I have to commend the department because I think the professionalism of many of the people that work within the neighbourhood renewal unit added to the many changes that have taken place in that thing. Although I did have some problems with the continuous changing of team leaders over a period of time, and I think we put a continuity would have a problem. But and I do think one of the big problems that you had, and you've touched on it, Chris, and that is that it was supposed to be an executive-led, run by DSD, but an executive-led programme. There was supposed to be a committee there made up of ministers that would oversee. I think that departments were supposed to bring resources to the table to flourish, and I think that's what was happening in parts of Scotland, parts of England, that different elements of council and departments brought that thing, but it never materialised. And I think that given the difficulties, and I think in the first year the committee only met once. I think in the second year, maybe 18 months or something. So it wasn't through a lack of effort by the people that were running neighbourhood renewal and the communities worked in. I think the fault lay with further up the lane in terms of ministerial approaches on how neighbourhood renewal worked. And I think that if you look back to 2003 and afterwards, I agree with Alec, you know, maybe some people should go into neighbourhood renewal areas and speak to people there and look at the impact that neighbourhood renewal has had over that period of time. 2002 there was little capacity, few community structures, very few people actually discussing the impact that deprivation was having, and neighbourhood renewal helped change all that. I think in many of the neighbourhood renewals areas you have vibrant community structures that have started to deal with it. And saying that, you know, I always had certain problems and difficulties with the way the whole thing was run and the hoops that local communities had to be put through, were getting put through at the time. But I think by and large that neighbourhood renewal, and if you speak to people out there in communities, they're more concerned about what's going to replace neighbourhood renewal, and that there can be some continuity in the process that was begun in 2003. So I think that you have all that there, and I think that the establishment of partnership boards that drew statutory authorities, politicians, and community activists together to sit down and discuss and develop strategies to deal with it, I think was excellent. And I remember Alec was the chair of the first one in West Belfast, and for the first time you were actually sitting down and discussing the serious problems that people faced. I always believed it was underfunded, under-resourced, and that it probably could have made much more of a difference had other departments and other people and other elements of the big silo system that existed took more of an interest in it. Would have been far better off today for that.
Okay, Roy?
Again, thanks for your presentation. One of the things that is different from previously is the new councils and their increasing role within the local communities, and particularly the power of community planning. So what potential do you think it has to assist better joint working between council and other departments and to ensure better value for money for this type of funding?
Well, under the powers, you have, what's the phrase? The
community planning.
You've got the statutory partners.
Statutory partners.
You've got statutory partners, and the departments all have an obligation to have regard to the community plans which the councils develop. So the idea behind it is, I presume, is clearly to try and get a more coherent and joined up approach, which the councils are leading, identifying, using their local knowledge to identify local need, or to enhance the physical, social, and economic development of their areas.
Okay, looking at my own area, you know, I can think of some very deprived areas. North Ward, I think it came out 93 of the 890 in terms of deprivation, multiple deprivation measures, and 128. And I'm aware on the ground of how there is a need for additional support for the community there to now allow the community and individuals to better themselves. But when I read this report, one of the recommendations is that there should be a spatial minimum of 10,000 people. Does that number of 10,000, does that mean you have to have 10,000 people in the qualifying condition?
It's a recommendation that the consultants put forward because they looked at similar programmes delivered in urban. This was an urban initiative. Yeah. Now, if you look at the number of neighbourhood renewal areas in Northern Ireland, there's 36 of them, of which 9 of them are 10,000 or bigger. Yeah. But neighbourhood renewal also had an approach to small pockets of deprivation. The issue here is it's entirely for councils to decide. This in no way says councils have to do anything. It just says an observation for urban renewal programmes. Other jurisdictions have found that 10,000.
If there were a recommendation 10,000 adopted, would that mean basically it could only happen in Belfast?
And in Derry, Londonderry.
Just the two locations?
It would be very... 10,000 would be very challenging for us to do within the neighbourhood renewal strategy, not less what would happen when it goes to the local councils where you have a smaller locality. And that's where I think it came out in the evaluation about the not just geographical interventions but also themed interventions. So, I mean, what we would see coming out of this evaluation is that it's not necessarily just the numbers of people, it's identifying where the need is. And if you have need across a number of areas which is similar, i.e. an educational need or a training need or whatever, then you would look at interventions that would be themed that could be delivered across those areas.
If the funding were to follow simply those where there was this 10,000 trigger, what would happen to disadvantaged areas in my own constituency which wouldn't qualify?
The funding is not going to be allocated to areas that are 10,000 or more. I mean, the point is on this that this was looking at urban regeneration approaches across the world, and they said that there's a certain scale that helps people deliver more effective programmes. Distribution of the funds across for the neighbourhood renewal funds to the councils under the reform of local government, it has nothing to do with that. It's done on a completely different basis.
So small pockets of deprivation funding, has that continued?
No. The councils have all all know what their funding distribution is under the reform of local government for the monies that were used to deliver neighbourhood renewal, and that's entirely independent of this report.
Did squad funding form part of that?
Yes, as did areas of risk. Small pockets of funding is an integral part of the neighbourhood renewal programme, but areas of risk is a separate funding stream. But that also forms part of the.
It was distributed. It was distributed with a number of factors, but population size and the number of people, in deprivation in the areas were the factors that were used to get the allocations to the different councils.
I'm just conscious that there are some areas in my own constituency need, and some where there's still a very, very weak community infrastructure to even draw down lottery or any other funding, and it's vital that there is some focus on such weak areas to try and bring about improvement there as well. So, thank you.
I guess it might be helpful to address social need in terms of regeneration bill, isn't it, this discussion? We'll do it in the chamber. Frau, you wanted to make a final point?
I wanted to make a point, Chair, that social need was a crucial element of the neighbourhood renewal. It was being delivered. It was being passed as part of the regeneration bill. Okay. People can complain all they want here, but they've just removed that totally from the face of the bill. So any difficulties or problems that may be raised, people need to look at their own doorsteps.
Well, important as our committee is we haven't removed any off the face of the bill as yet. So, okay. Is there any other comments to be made? Could I, Chris, thank yourself and Barbara and John for your attention this morning presenting that report. And obviously there's a lot in that, and we obviously will take time to absorb it, but your comments have been very helpful to allow us to further drill down on that report.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very, very much now. Okay, members, that will conclude, unless there's anything you want to specifically say or do in relation to this. I mean, obviously it is something we need to absorb. Okay, members, so thanks very much. Meeting stands adjourned.